Hi, I'm Jean Schumacher, founder of the Plant-Based Academy, where I provide help, guidance, support, and resources to switch to a plant-based lifestyle and get your health back. Today, I have the privilege of connecting with Dr. Frank Sabatino from Balance for Life, Florida, and author of the book Weightless. He's also the director of health education for the National Health Association. And tonight, we're going to be beginning a discussion on his book Weightless, Part 1, and we're going to be discussing essential facts and fundamentals. So thank you, Dr. Sabatino, for taking the time to be with us here tonight.
Thank you for inviting me, and I'm happy to just welcome everybody. Good evening.
Well, first up question I have from a member of the Plant-Based Academy, and she asks, I always fast at least 16 hours per day. I feel great eating only 2 meals a day. However, I'm finding that when I eat 1 meal per day, I feel even better. Are there any health and longevity benefits to eating 1 meal per day? Is there any issues?
In the 1980s, I was very fortunate to be an assistant professor at probably the most extensive aging research center in the world at that time at the University of Texas. And they pioneered the work on calorie restriction and aging, which meant that what they observed, and many people have observed it before that and since then, that if you took, in this case, it was rats, and you gave them an amount of food that allowed them to play, nibble, and reproduce, and then you took that amount of calories that they consumed and reduced it by 40% and fed it to another group of animals, those animals would live 50% longer. So that notion would be like us adding 40 years to our lives by the simple act of calorie restriction. The only issue with that, though, is that when you restrict calories, there's a chance that you could restrict nutrients. So those animals were supplemented in a certain way to ensure that they would not have, vitamin and mineral deficiencies. My only intermittent fasting in humans, having some calorie restriction has some value, and it could have major value. The only problem is, depending on how much you're restricting food intake, there is a possibility that you could be restricting nutrient intake. So the question is, can you maintain the nutrient density and the basic nutrient requirements by eating 1 meal a day? It may be difficult to do that. And it may be that having a little bit more diversity and addition within the window of the time that you're eating would probably establish less of a problem. So I can't say that it's an issue for you, but the likelihood is that the volume you could probably eat at 1 meal and the diversity of nutrients in 1 meal probably would be shorted. I think it probably would be short. So I would say long term, I think you'd probably be better sticking with the 2 meals and making sure that they're pretty diverse.
Well, perhaps if that person did that like 1 meal a day, did it like maybe once a week or something like that.
There's an interesting guy, drsteveblake.com, who I know and I've interviewed. And Steve is a nutritional biochemist, and he has a program where if you go on that site, he has a way of evaluating your dietary plan and really look at nutrient density for you. It wouldn't be the worst idea to do that and see where you stand, because you could supplement some of those things, but we're always really much more akin to using whole foods than we are supplements. So my feeling is that I think you would be better off doing a diversity of meals, maybe at least another meal for sure.
Heart disease, cancer, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and obesity cost U.S. healthcare systems $400 to $575 million a day. Obesity accounts for 70% of all deaths annually worldwide. Just being overweight is a significant risk factor in four most profound causes of death in the Western world. Talk to us about these causes of death.
The obesity is arguably the risk factor associated with disability, disease, and death that is most within the reach of everyone. It's something that is within our control. So it's one of those conditions that and situations that we can really muster our lifestyle choices for to really change. I found it shocking that 40% of the world right now is either overweight or obese. So if you think about 8 billion people on the planet or so, we're looking at 2 billion people that are dealing with this particular issue. And it is probably the most directed cause risk factor for heart disease, cancer, diabetes, stroke, and so on. So when you think about the fact that those chronic degenerative diseases demand the most healthcare dollars of our healthcare system, which by the way is now close to $5 trillion a year. I mean, that's kind of mind-boggling. The specific on that is, think about this. If you could spend close to $7 million a day, how many of our people in our audience would like to spend $7 million? I don't even know if you could do it. I mean, it would be a difficult thing to do. Now imagine that you could spend $7 million, a little less than $7 million a day, every day since the day that Jesus Christ was born until the present day, the last 2,000 years. You would not spend what we spend in 1 year on healthcare system in the US. I mean, think about that. That's a mind-boggling idea. So the bottom line is, many of these conditions, most of these conditions are really preventable, and they are not only preventable, they're reversible. You know, many of the health policy experts have suggested that of that $5 trillion that we're spending, about 70% of it is being spent for conditions that are completely fixable and reversible by routine lifestyle choices. So the simplicity of this is that obesity, and when I say this, I mean being overweight and over fat. And I want to emphasize that because too often we just get lost in the numbers on the scale. And I want to emphasize that that's not the best way to really examine this risk. We need to look at the percentage of that weight that is actually fat related, and we can address the importance of that as we go on here. But the bottom line is, it is the most preventable form of disability, disease, and death. It plays a major role in all of these other major chronic disease factors, including diabetes and heart disease, which are major, major killers and devastating conditions in our culture. And it's something that is most preventable within our reach of lifestyle choice.
I'm glad we talked about the fat, because I always thought that fat cells were just these big blobs, rather inert, just hanging there. But now we know so much more. I mean, much more. Talk to us about what we know about these fat cells.
All right. Yeah. You know, and your point is well made. You know, we always had this image of fat cells as being this kind of inert cell doing nothing, maybe helping us, making us look a little less attractive cosmetically, but certainly no real biological concern. Boy, were we wrong. The fact of the matter is, many people now are looking at the fat compartment of the body as an organ unto itself, like we would discuss the heart or the kidney or the liver. As it turns out, fat cells are producing a remarkable array of hormones, enzymes, and even inflammatory chemicals that play a role in the communication between fat, the hormonal and nervous systems of the body, releasing chemicals that are primary in promoting inflammation. And this is important because when you have certain markers in the body, first of all, when we say the word inflammation, I think for most people, this of course has a negative connotation. When in fact, the fact of the matter is, the inflammatory process of the body is one of the most important health promoting processes that there is. If it wasn't for our ability to produce inflammation, we would not be able to heal tissue damage when we get injured. We would not be able to mount a response to bacterial and viral infection. So inflammation in and of itself is a primary supportive function of the body. However, when it becomes more chronically generated, meaning that it's going beyond that initial attempt to really resolve tissue damage and infection, it can be a primary problem within its own right. And we see this in our culture when we realize that many of the degenerative diseases that we talk about, whether it's heart disease, cancer, and the like, are diseases fundamentally of chronic inflammation. And that's really important to think about. Now, when you have an inflammatory process, if you think about this, the body needs to know where to exert that process. If I damage my arm, injure it, and I tear it open, or I have an injury of some kind, and the body needs to heal that cut or that trauma, it needs to direct my immune system to that location. And as it turns out, the body releases a series of compounds that are kind of like markers of like a GPS for the immune system. They're called cytokines. And cytokines would be kind of like if you were diving out in the ocean and you would put a red buoy on the surface of the water so boats going by would know that there was a diver there. It's kind of like that. It helps the immune system target where to go to help us. So cytokines are used for that purpose. However, when you have chronic inflammation, you get a storm of these chemicals, a flurry of these chemicals that are often referred to as the cytokine storm. And as it turns out, many different cells and conditions of the body generate their own class of these markers. As it turns out, the fat cells of the body have a huge population of these that are referred to as not as cytokines, but as adipokines, because a fat cell is called an adipocyte, adipose, like adipose tissue, fat. So adipocyte is a fat cell. Adipokines are the cytokines produced and released by these fat cells. And the bottom line is that is a huge process and a huge population of inflammatory generating chemicals. Now you can measure these. They're interleukins, you got TNF alpha, you've got a whole population, macrocyte colony stimulating factors. There's a whole series of these chemicals that have sophisticated names, but they are all part of this family of cytokines that are tied into the infection. As it turns out, as body fat and weight go up, there is a remarkable increase in these inflammatory markers. You can make the case that the increase in body weight and body fat is a primary condition that triggers exaggerated inflammation and ultimately chronic inflammation. This was seen remarkably in the COVID pandemic. These SARS viruses are basically respiratory viruses. So the immune system has to target this virus in the area of the lungs and the respiratory system. So if you already had higher body fat or you were eating a lot of, animal products and processed food, you already were generating a pretty high level of inflammation. Now, when you got infected and the immune system needed to ratchet up the inflammatory process to attack the virus, now you could create an exaggerated inflammatory response that would create a cytokine storm, now congesting the lungs and contributing to the respiratory distress that was part of the COVID infection. And a classic manifestation of that was that people that had body mass indices above 28 to 30, which would put you into the level of obesity, were 6 times more likely to end up on a respirator with COVID infection. So we saw that in the population of people with overweight and overfat. Fat cells also produce certain enzymes. A classic one is an enzyme called aromatase. Aromatase converts testosterone into estrogen. So as fat cells go up, you're ratcheting up an enzyme that could increase estrogen to such a level that it could promote estrogen-related tumors and cancers of the breast and ovary and uterus. And we also see this in men that put on a lot of body fat. What do you notice about those men? They start to develop breasts. They start getting it looks like breast tissue in men. They're converting their testosterone to estrogen. So they're becoming estrogenized by this process of body weight and body fat. So the relationship of body fat to a wide range of inflammatory conditions and the increase of inflammatory markers and enzymes that promote hormonal imbalance and disturbance is very, very profound.
You already answered my next question.
Oh,
Move on.
I'm so prophetic. See how that is? Okay, yes. Okay.
I love that. I love that about you. Well, okay, here's the $1,000,000 question that we've been trying to answer, at least personally myself. What is the basic requirement for successful weight loss?
Okay. The basic requirements for successful weight loss are obviously a constellation of factors that we now know. And this includes, of course, the food that we're eating. There's no question. And, we can go deeply into this, but when you're eating a plant exclusive diet, understand that that diet is what? Well, it's very high in fiber, number one, but it's also very low in calorie density and very high in nutrient density. So, meaning that if you look at fruits and vegetables, they only run about 65 to maybe a couple of hundred calories per pound. So you could eat pounds of vegetation. You could go out to lunch with your pet elephant and it won't matter because by the time you chewed through all of that volume, it would only be a very restricted number of calories. So calorie density is very real. If you compare fruits and vegetables and whole grains to something like, fish, dairy, cheese, meat, they're closer to upwards of, 1,500 to 2,000 calories a pound. So you can begin to see that if you're looking at processed foods and junk foods, they're up around 1,000 to 2,000 calories a pound. So, what we've discovered is that when you are eating a broad, diverse diet of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes like lentils and peas and beans and so on, you're eating a diet that is somewhere in the range of about 65 to about 700 calories per pound. All the other foods are going to be much, much higher, way higher in calorie density. And while nuts are a very valuable part of this diet, they are upwards of 2,000 to 3,000 calories a pound. So the amount that you can consume in the diet, we only recommend an ounce or two in a day. So if you eat a broad-based diet, you're creating this very low calorie density. The American Cancer Institute and other institutes associated with cancer development, we didn't even get into the relationship of fat to cancer, we can circle back to this, have suggested that for us to really create an ideal body fat, body weight, and reduce the risk of heart disease and cancer, we want a diet on average that is about 600 calories a pound. So for my money, that means that 95% of our eating plan needs to come from whole, fresh fruits, vegetables, whole grains, starches, legumes, lentils, beans, and peas. Small amount from avocado, nuts, and seeds, and no processed and no animal-based products at all. Or if you're eating them, a very, very minimal amount of those foods. So the dietary plan is very clear. And fat, because fat is the most calorie dense part of the diet, think about this. Fat provides 9 calories of energy for every gram that you consume. Protein and starches only provide 4 calories per gram. So every time you eat a gram of fat, it's 2.25 times more intake of calories than if you were eating protein or carbohydrate. So you can see how consuming fat generates incredible calorie density over time. So the interesting thing is, when you look at whole foods, many times they provide all of the basic macronutrients. They provide protein, starch, a protein, carbohydrate, and fat. But here's the other beautiful thing. If you look at something like salmon and cheese, just for the sake of argument, they're going to provide about, we made the point, they're going to be upwards of 1,500 to 2,000 calories a pound. They're going to provide about 25 to 40 to 50% of their calories are coming from protein when you look at animal body parts like that. And so they're providing protein, but here's the issue about they're providing also close to 40% to 50% of their calories from fat. If you look at things like lentils and beans, they provide about the same, very close to the same protein content by weight, about 25 to 35% protein, but only 5% of their calories are from fat. So if you really want to eat a protein food that's going to provide you with all the protein you need for hormones and maintenance and muscle growth and all repair, your best bet are greens and legumes because they're going to give you all of that protein with a very low fat content. Enough fat, but certainly not enough to provide that calorie density. So the food is one issue. And then we know that factors that involve everything from activity to sleep to stress and stress response, environmental toxicity that we're exposed to. All of those features, all of those factors are part of the constellation of factors that affect long-term successful weight loss. And that's why I wrote the book, because the book is probably the only book that covers and addresses that constellation of factors and even the psychological factors associated with addiction and how we generate pleasure and reward and all of that. And it's the only book that addresses it from the standpoint of compassion, understanding and helping people really understand that you do not have to damage, destroy, and attack any animal or harm any environment on this planet to have long-term successful weight loss. And you notice I keep saying long-term sustainable weight loss because a lot of the fad approaches that people do can promote some initial weight loss. But in the long run, they typically mortgage the health future of that person while at the same time causing reactive weight gain.
Oh, and I'm a classic example. I think I've done when my mother was alive, we were doing every diet known to mankind, and you lose weight, gain it back, lose weight, gain it back, lose weight, gain it back. And that's horrible on your body.
Look, 95 to 98% of people that take weight off with typical fad diets put it back on. Diets are basically, we're spending close to $70 billion on weight loss programs in the United States, and the outcome is a 99% failure rate. I mean, think about that. I mean, that's so what it does is it winds up creating a really remarkable sense of hopelessness
Mhm.
in people as they try to achieve, better weight and better body fat. And that's why I wanted to write this book of hope. It really is a manual of hope
Yeah.
because it outlines clearly how taking certain steps and doing them more routinely in your life will create the success you want, not only in this moment, but sustainably across time.
Well, and for sure. I mean, this is the only thing that without counting calories or carbs or portion control that I've been able to lose weight. I mean, I still have weight to lose because my fat and I have been together for a long time and it doesn't want
Yeah,
to
but you have come such a. I happened to look at the recent NHA magazine, and I saw your little story in the back, and the picture, the before picture, is unbelievable. I mean, you've come a long way, baby. I mean, that's the
Well, and
truth.
that's not at my heaviest. I gave them several pictures and they didn't pick, and I didn't have many when I was at that height, that weight. Truth be
And
told.
we need to emphasize that because there are a lot of people out there suffering with this idea that they can't really achieve those kinds of goals. And we're here to say that you can. It is hopeful, it is within your reach, but you've got to take a bigger vision, a bigger picture of what it is. And while food is incredibly important, as I've just discussed briefly, it's really one piece of an entire constellation of factors that if you can set them in even just a little bit, they're going to make a huge, huge impact on the outcome.
Oh, it's so true. Okay, and I know you mentioned protein, so I'm going to jump on that bandwagon because I
Yeah.
can't tell you how many times I've gotten the question, "Oh my God, where are you going to get your protein from?" And
We laugh about this because in all the years of talking at conferences, that was always the question. Where am I going to get my protein? We become such a protein obsessed and protein phobic culture. The biggest deficiency in the United States is not protein, it's fiber.
right,
That's the biggest deficiency. And the bottom line is, if you think about this, and this is very real, when protein was first discovered, we realized its importance, and that's why it was given the name protein from the word proteus, which means of the first importance. And unfortunately, because of its importance, and it is important, it has become an obsession in our culture, and we have been inundated from the moment we have all been born with this idea that protein is really the golden fleece of nutrition, and you've got to be completely obsessed with it, and you can't live without it. And the only place you can get it is from the bodies and fluids of other animals, which has been one of the biggest con jobs in the history of biology from the beginning of time. I mean, think about this. What are the largest land mammals on planet Earth? They're all elephants and rhinos and hippos and large non-human primates. where they're getting all of their protein from whole plant foods. I tell people the adult male elephant is the largest walking mammal on planet Earth, and it can weigh in at 10 to 15,000 pounds with the largest muscle mass of any animal on planet Earth. And elephants, by the way, are only about 5 to 6% body fat. So they are some lean and mean creatures on planet Earth. And what are they maintaining all of that huge protein mass on? The protein in leaves, grass, and the bark of trees. And I tell people, do you think an elephant gets up one day, looks out on the savannah, and says, where am I going to get my chicken nuggets? No, it doesn't do that. Where am I going to get that piece of salmon? No, it doesn't do that. We are select herbivores that are really designed in terms of our design, our teeth, our dentition, the length of our digestive tract, the size of our liver, the function of our kidneys, that are really built to take our nutrients from whole plant foods. And if you even look at, I call my three professors, Professor Bonobo, Professor Chimpanzee, and Professor Gorilla. Those are my three major professors. They have between 97 and 99.9% of the same gene pool, DNA, as us. And their diets are primarily fruits, shoots, roots, all of those things. Now, they will eat some meat. They will eat a foe that they conquer, but it's usually more of like that kind of thing than it is nutritional need. And the one that is closest to us that has really, in many ways, the greatest amount of DNA similar to us is the bonobo. And the bonobo is a very upright, almost human-looking, non-human primate, and they primarily consume fruit in the canopy. So they're basically fruit eaters, and they're also called the hippies of the primate world, and they most resemble us. And they're called the hippies of the primate world because, in a way, they resolve all of their major stress with rampant promiscuous sexuality, which is kind of intriguing. But the bottom line is, this is the interesting thing. They are also probably one of the most empathic and probably the most empathic primate in the animal world. There has never been any evidence of a bonobo killing another bonobo ever in the history of looking at bonobos who live in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, south of the Congo River in Africa. So I think for many of us, it would behoove us to let out our inner bonobo, so to speak. But the bottom line is, what we are getting, the protein needs are satisfied beautifully by whole plant foods, especially a diversity of greens, whole grains, starches, legumes like lentils, beans, peas, potatoes. All of those foods will give you all the protein you will ever need. I have been doing this program for close to 50 years. Last animal protein, major flesh protein, was in 1971. Does it look like I'm fading away? No. I've been on this planet 3/4 of a century, taking protein only from plant sources. I maintain the same muscle mass and body fat percentage I had 40 years ago. I need you to hear that. And so this has been one of the biggest, and I want people to think about this because this is important. And I go over this in my lectures. If I ask the audience to think about, we're talking about the importance of protein, and I ask you to think about, okay, protein is important. Then I ask you, why is it important? What's it for? So people will often say muscles, like growth. Some people will say energy. But what people don't realize, if you think about it, all of the hormones and enzymes of the human body are all protein. So the body needs protein to make all of those chemicals that are involved in all of the maintenance functions and growth functions of the body. Yes, it is a big part of muscle. So muscle growth and repair and the repair of tissue damage all require protein. What we don't require protein for is for energy. And this is a very important concept because the only thing on planet Earth that can take the energy of the sun, which is the major source of energy for planet Earth, and convert it into food are plants. So through the process of photosynthesis, plants take sunlight, convert it into glucose or fructose in fruit, and then that will go into the energy factories of the cells called mitochondria, where the body will take the oxygen that you breathe and the glucose molecules that you consume and package them in high energy bonds that serve as the energy reserve for all that you and I need to do. So starches, carbohydrates equal energy. Protein equals growth and repair. So let me ask my adult audience out here, how many of you need to grow anymore? No. How many of you need energy? So what we need is a diet that is selectively off the charts in carbohydrate intake and nominal in protein intake. You need about 10 to 15% of your total calories coming from protein. That actually translates, according to the Department of the Nutrition, the people that set the recommended dietary guidelines, to about 0.36 grams per pound of body weight, which really, if you look at someone between the ranges of 100 to 200 pounds, it's about 35 to 55, 60 grams of protein a day. Most people can survive quite adequately on 40 to 50 grams of protein, which is only, if you think about the fact that 28 grams is an ounce, you only need an ounce and a half to 2 ounces of effective protein a day, which is provided off the charts in lentils and beans and greens and grains. So this has become one of the ridiculous arguments of all time, and plus the fact that proteins are made up of amino acids. That's the building block of protein. Well, the amino portion of amino acids requires a fundamental element called nitrogen. And if you think about the air we breathe, it's only about 20% oxygen and it's almost 80%, 78% to 80% nitrogen. The problem is living systems like us cannot take nitrogen from the air and produce amino acids. Only bacteria in the soil can fix that nitrogen into the roots and systems of plants. So all amino acids are fundamentally made by plants. So fundamentally, all proteins are made by plants. So you have two choices on planet Earth. You either eat plants directly or you eat the body of an animal that ate plants directly. The problem is when you eat animal bodies, there's a loss of energy down the food chain and a concentration of toxicity. So you become much more toxic and much less energetic. If you want to get maximum energy from the food you're eating, you need to shorten the food chain and eat food directly from those things that take it directly from the sun, which are plant foods. So the bottom line is all animal protein is nothing more than recycled plant protein. So why waste your time killing, destroying, and ripping the flesh from animal bodies to provide protein need? There is no reason to do it. And not only that, it plays into violence of all living creatures and it devastates our environment to boot. So why do it?
I know. Well, on the standard American diet, SAD for short, we typically see excess of protein intake, which
Yes,
has a
we do.
huge impact, negative impact on the human
Because of
body.
our obsession with it. That's the problem. We don't need it. And excessive protein creates urea, for example, which now becomes a major load on kidney. It actually toxifies the liver much more dramatically. It has so many negative effects, high protein intake on liver, kidney, joints, inflammation, and the like. Think about it. Amino acids in the word itself, it gives you an idea. They're acid forming compounds. So when you increase a lot of protein, you're increasing what we call metabolic acidosis. The body tends to be more alkaline and soothing in all of its fluids, in the blood, in the fluid in our joints, in our saliva. So when you're incurring all of this inflammatory chemistry in high protein intake, you're feeding diseases of chronic inflammation. So it's no mystery why we see an epidemic of chronic inflammatory diseases in our culture when people are obsessed with exaggerating the use of compounds like protein in their diet. There's no reason to do it.
And I just love in your book your comment that there's no animals in nature that isolate pure fat from the food chain and put it in big bottles of liquid fat and pour it over everything. Talk to us about the difference between saturated versus unsaturated fats. What's the difference? And why should we not cook with oil?
Well, here's the thing. When you look at this, you made the point. The fact of the matter is oil and fat are an absolute necessity in the human diet. We need a good 15% of calories coming from fat in the diet because fat does serve a role. If you think about it, we have probably 100 trillion cells in the human body. And the membrane of those cells, the actual picket fence that separates one cell from another, is made up of a fat and protein sandwich. So the fat content of our cells is critical. We need fat to produce all the cells of the human body. We need fat for a wide range of functions and actions in the human body. But what we don't need, what we need to understand is that when you eat whole foods, they're bringing in fat along with all of the symphony or the amount of other nutrients in those foods. If I isolate pure fat from a food, I'm now isolating it to the exclusion of all other nutrients. So for example, if I have nuts and I want to create walnut oil or avocado oil or coconut oil, I've left behind the fiber. I left behind the mineral content. I've left behind a lot of nutrient value in that food, especially the fiber content and other nutrients, by concentrating the calorie density. Because now, if you think about it, when we talked about fruits and vegetables being 100 to 400 calories a pound, oils are 4,000 calories a pound. So if you think about that just from that standpoint, that becomes incredibly problematic. If you took a piece of romaine lettuce and just kind of did that between your fingers, you would see oil on your fingertips. I think the estimate is that if you ate nothing but lettuce, you would already have a diet that's 5 to 7% fat. So the oil content in fruits, vegetables, and plants is more than adequate to satisfy our needs. And certain foods need to, and let's go a step further. The building blocks of fats are chemicals called fatty acids, which is nothing more than a chain of carbon atoms with hydrogens attached. And at one end, there's a little acid fragment, which makes it a fatty acid. If every space on the chain of the fatty acid is filled with hydrogen, that chain is very stable and very saturated. And because it's saturated and stable, it'll tend to be solid in the temperature of the room chemically. So if you look at a piece of meat and you see fat that marbles that meat, at room temperature, that's solid saturated fat. And the problem with that is it'll tend to be solid in the temperature of your body. And so it can saturate along blood vessel walls and the body of organs and tissues. If I now remove hydrogen from that carbon chain, I create spaces on that chain. When I create spaces on that chain becomes more unstable, meaning it's more prone to destruction by light and heat and temperature, and it also becomes more unsaturated. And because it's more unstable and unsaturated, it tends to exist as a liquid in the temperature of the room. So when you go down the oil aisle of your supermarket and you see canola oil and olive oil and all these oils, they exist in what kind of a state? Well, they're in an oil form. Now, as it turns out, that's going to be a little less problematic in the body because if you think about cells, they want to be able to allow nutrients to enter and waste products to leave. And all of those things need to move through the membrane of the cell that is made up of fat and protein. So the fats in all of our cells have to be very mobile and liquidy to allow things to glide and slide and dance through those membranes. So all the cells of the body are loaded with polyunsaturated fats in their membranes, not saturated. So the more you incur saturated fat in the system, you can start to damage the lining of those cells. They become more aged. And as it turns out, when we look at fat, it's not only the amount that's the problem, but what happens to it when it is cooked, prepared, and processed. And there are three modifications that become important. One is when you put high heat into a fat, you start adding hydrogen back to those spaces in the process called hydrogenation. So you can take a healthy unsaturated fat and through cooking and processing, you can convert it into something that's more solid, stable, and more dangerous in the human body, more linked with heart disease, cancers, and the like. That's why we never recommend sauteing with oil or cooking with oil. We recommend using things like vegetable broth or balsamic vinegar or lemon and vinegar or things of that nature that you can use to kind of gently saute things. Or even in things like an Instant Pot, you can put onions and they will sweat and you can just use the juice of the onion as a liquid in the pot to saute things. You don't need oil to cook with. Now, not only does oil become hydrogenated when you put high heat and pressure into it, but it becomes transformed. Its architecture changes. And remember, in nature, there's a concept that says structure determines function. So everything in nature has a certain structure, and based on its architecture, it typically functions in a certain way. So, for example, if I have a chair with four legs and I remove a leg, the architecture has now changed. That chair will not function the way it did before. If you try to sit on it, you fall on your butt. So it won't work. Well, all molecules in the body have a three-dimensional structure that allows them to function in a certain way. When you put high heat and pressure into the cells, into fat, it transforms that structure. Now, the transformed structure will look somewhat the same to the human body, and the body may put it into the membrane of cells, or may try to use it the way it would normally use fat, but because its structure has been altered, no longer functions that way, the way the original fats do. So we now know, for example, that if you have more transformed fats from the cooking and processing of fats, when you put that into a cell membrane, because it'll look somewhat the same to the body, that cell will now allow things to enter that it normally would block, and it blocks things that it normally would allow to enter. So we know that when people are eating more processed foods, donuts and fried foods and all of these foods and heavily cooked animal products and oils, you're generating a lot of trans fats, which dramatically increase inflammation. There are studies showing clearly that there is a dose response relationship between the increased intake of junk and processed food and the outcome of inflammation in the body. And we also know that now it would normally protect you against viral or bacterial infection, but now it may allow those viruses and bacteria to enter cells easier. Think about what was happening during the pandemic. People were quarantined in homes, told not to exercise, not to move. They were eating a lot more junk food in their own homes. All of the things that would have helped their immune system fight that virus were actually separated from their lives. And now they were eating much more trans and altered fats that were increasing their risk for viral infection. Did anybody get on the TV, any of those talking heads, and tell you anything about that? Of course not. And if anybody did, it was a conspiracy. What the conspiracy was not telling you that and gearing you up for vaccines that have in no way did even close to just eating plant-based foods for reducing the outcome of infection. And there are numerous studies internationally that showed that people eating whole plant foods were in the lowest risk of severity for that infection. And there are international studies all over the world. So I had such a problem with all of that in my own consciousness. But the bottom line is the third modification then is not only do fats get hydrogenated, not only do they get oxidized, not only do they get transformed, they become oxidized. They become converted into a unique form of oxidant called free radicals that are devastating and are involved with most of the major diseases of the human body. And the barbecuing and grilling and frying of animal products and ultra processed foods with high heat and all of that generate the most dangerous lipid free radical known to man called the lipid peroxy radical, which can get into the membranes of all cells and promote mutagenesis, cancer formation, devastating chronic inflammatory change, disease, and the like. So it's not only the amount of fat, it's also what happens to it when it is cooked, prepared, and processed. And those three changes are simply hydrogenation, transformation, and oxidation.
I just go back to your comment on, I mean, first of all, there's so many things we could talk about, like paths, wow. But I think about your comment about during COVID, how plant-based people, and I interviewed a whole family that had right in the beginning of plant-based, or right in the beginning of COVID, and everybody was hysterical with COVID, and people were dying like left and right and center.
Oh,
And
terrible.
these people, I mean, it was a all grandparents, parents, and children. And the grandparents got like 102-degree fever, had it for a couple of days. The parents had a low, like 101, 102 fever for 2 days. The children had a low grade fever for a day. That was it. And, and I think back to that and I was like, oh my God. And then in the history, as the historian for the NHA, I heard about in 1832, they had a huge epidemic that, and there was the Bible Christian Church that was in the epicenter of this epidemic in Philadelphia. Not one of them died of this disease that had decimated the population in 1832. We knew it. They were already not quite, they considered themselves vegetarians because the word plant-based didn't come into a long time, not that long ago. So vegan, the term vegan didn't even come into play till 1944. What would you say would be the best way for us to measure body fat?
Well, they measure body fat in several ways. They use conduction measurements. They use dunking. Typically, the best way was really dunking people in water tanks and looking at water displacement. That's what most of the professional teams do and all of that. I don't think you need to really get lost in that. I think generally speaking, if you have a certain body weight and you can look at your body, I mean, you can see it, and you're eating plant-based foods and so on, you'll see a certain amount of leanness that will be present. You'll have a BMI. See, most people use body mass indices to measure the risk factors for obesity. The problem with body mass index, it's really only a ratio of height and weight. So many high performance athletes with very low body fat percentage would come up as being obese with body mass index measurements, and we know they're not. You take someone like a LeBron James, 260 to 270 pounds at 6'8", he would come up as obese on a BMI, but he's only got 3 to 5% body fat. So he's not having a risk factor with his weight. So what people have now gone to is what's called the BRI, which really wasn't as prevalent when I wrote the book, which is called the body roundness index. And what they do now is they take your height, your weight, your waist measurement, your hip measurement, and your neck measurement. And they put that into an algorithm and come up with body roundness index. Because we now know that the increase in visceral belly fat, abdominal fat, as that goes up, you have tremendous risk factors for disease. So looking at the compartments of body fat and all of that are really a better way to go. But right now, most people would do BMIs, and there are gyms that do caliper measurements, squeezing tissue. There's a lot of big error in that. The biological error can be 30% in some of those measurements. It's way too high. So generally speaking, doing conduction measurements or dissolving the entire body. And there's a way to use an MRI type measurement to look at body fat, but we'd have to go into being completely liquid to do it. But we're not going to do that. So I would look at have people look up the new thing called BRI. Okay. Not only that, it's all on your phone. You can go to BRI, punch in a few numbers, it'll print out your BRI right on your phone.
Carbs. It's one of the 3 macronutrients, the foundation of all animal energy production, and made exclusively by plants.
Right.
Fortunately, carbs have gotten an unfair reputation, largely thanks to paleo, keto, which vilifies carbs and reveres protein. So what is the truth about the carbohydrates?
The problem isn't only that. The problem is no one segregated the idea of natural whole plant carbohydrates and refined carbohydrates. So in most people's minds, the word carbohydrate means all of that. So there's no segregation of understanding, refined sugar products and ultra processed foods with refined carbohydrates versus the whole plant carbs produced in fruit and vegetables and starches and whole grains. So the first thing you have to realize is that we are herbivores. We are carbohydrate eaters by nature. That needs to be 95% of the diet. And within those carbs, you're going to get protein and fat that you'll need, but the diet needs to be all of, carbohydrate based, all of those plant foods. So the real key is the problem with paleo diets and keto diets is they're exaggerating nutrients that create health risk. For example, in a keto diet, no human being is really effectively going to do well on a diet that is 65 to 90% fat. It's a ridiculous concept, plus the fact that most of those fats are coming in animal products. So the diet is so completely devoid of fiber. Fiber content is so critical for the health of the microbiome, for so many sustaining functions in the human body. Paleo diets, these high protein diets, now create those risk factors with kidney and liver and transit time in the gut. So the fact of the matter is we need a diet We have the longest digestive tract of all animals, of all primates for sure. We need a diet that's high in fiber and water for effective transit, for effective bacterial load, to really provide the basic nutrients that we need. The nutrient density, the phytonutrients, the vitamins, the mineral content are all in plant foods. When you try to move away from those foods and start loading up on more highly dense fat and protein diets coming from animal sources, it's very, very problematic. And the worst of all is the carnivore diet. This is, to me, one of the biggest con jobs and ridiculous things I've ever seen in human dietary discipline. There are no humans that are carnivores. Not one human being is a carnivore on planet Earth. If you want to show me that you're a carnivore, I need to see you running in full stride, jumping on the back of a zebra and ripping out a piece of its ass with your front teeth. Until you can do that, you're not a carnivore. We don't have teeth that can chew through the hide of a raw, dead animal. Our teeth couldn't do it. So we're not carnivores by any way, shape, or form. We are animals that are designed to eat the succulent plants, fruits, and vegetables and things that are grown on planet Earth. And certain starches and things which cannot be eaten directly in that state can be eaten sprouted or cooked, and they still will have tremendous nutrient value, like beans and things of that nature. So there is no place, in my opinion, for these diets, and they've only set people back, because what they do is you can't stay on them for life. You got to come off of them. As soon as you do, you have reactive weight gain. We've talked about this roller coaster of these diets all the time. And we just need to embrace this high, diverse, plant-based carbohydrate approach that provides adequate protein and fat in the process. And we're getting that incredible energetics from the plant world, taking that energy directly from the sun.
Well, I have to say, when I go shopping, I almost always get a comment from the cashier about how healthy my choices are, because I'm sure they see a lot of stuff going by all the time. And then they always make a comment about it, because especially the greens. I mean, like, I have so much,
Oh,
And
absolutely.
there was an
Well,
article.
if you think about the fact that you Americans are taking 50 to 60% of their diet from ultra processed junk food, 30% of their diet to provide 30 to 40% of their diet to provide 80% of their protein from animal products, less than 5% from fruits and vegetables, and less than 1%, 1 to 2% of greens from greens. So if you think about what people are going down those assembly lines in the supermarket, they don't see that kind of nutrition at all. I mean, they don't see it.
No.
It's eye popping, it's eye popping.
Well, there was an article that was published in the Wall Street Journal titled "The Supermarket Shopping Basket," which focused on what Americans are spending their food dollars on when they go shopping.
I have
I
that in
mean,
my book. Yes, it's startling.
oh
It's
my God.
the number one was, of course, sodas. That was the number one item.
Yeah.
Then down around fifth or sixth was beer and something else. I think it was 23rd on the list were vegetables, right behind toilet paper, which I guess makes sense. And fruit did not make the top 50 items of the shopping list of the American public. Think about that. It
And
is just unconscionable. It's just unconscionable. It really, truly is. It's unconscionable.
it is. It is. And it's just on so many levels it's sad. And just to follow up on that, I was subbing in some of the local schools, and I'm appalled at seeing what the kids are eating. Just appalled. And it's no wonder that they can't function or think like we used to be
It's
able
no
to.
wonder why in the last 30 years, the most rapidly growing group of overfat and overweight people have been children under the age of 18. It's a sad commentary on the culture, because they're going to be aging and dealing with chronic degenerative diseases much earlier in their lives in a way that we have never before seen in human history.
Right.
And that's a problem. And the toll that will take financially, no one's going to be able to afford that.
I know.
You just will not be able to afford that.
Blood sugar control is one of the most important functions of the body,
Yeah.
and we're always concerned about, that we have enough glucose in our blood to meet our energy needs. Just how does the body keep the blood sugar in a healthy, normal range?
Well, it's important to realize that sugar is an incredibly important commodity, especially blood glucose. We made the point that the glucose that we have is used by our energy factories in combination with the oxygen that we breathe to produce all the packets of energy that we need to do everything that we do. So the body is incredibly concerned that we have adequate sugar. And in fact, there are a couple of cells in the body, different cells that are uniquely glucose dependent. One of those are brain cells. If you think about it, the brain is only 2% of our body weight, but requires 20% of our energy. So that's a really important energy sink in the body. And the other are red blood cells, where we store sugar across time, which is why many of our audience people may have done blood tests where they measured something called hemoglobin A1C. If I stick a needle in your arm and take out a blood sample and measure the glucose in your blood, I'm really only measuring blood sugar in that moment. I have no idea what it looks like across time. But if I take the hemoglobin A1C measurement, the body's putting glucose in red blood cells across months. So you can get a much bigger picture of how that's happening. Now, understand that while glucose is imperative for energy production, it's also a double-edged sword. As sugar levels go up in the body, sugar becomes one of the most toxic, devastating compounds in the human body, and it will eat its way through the human body. Think about what happens to people with high blood sugar over time, diabetics. They lose their eyes, they lose their hearts, they lose their kidneys, they amputate their limbs. It's a major issue. So the body is stuck with the dilemma: how am I going to maintain an adequate glucose level within a very respectable range of normal, so that sugar is not getting too high to damage the body and too low to not provide my basic energy needs? Well, to do that, it releases a hormone from the beta cells of your pancreas called insulin. And insulin will travel in the bloodstream, and it will attach to receptors on the surface of cells that are kind of like locks on a door, where insulin is the key. Think about sticking a key in the lock of a door, turning it, your door swings open. When insulin attaches to these locks on the surface of cells, there's a door in the membrane that opens up, and sugar can now enter those cells to go into the energy production machinery. Now, glucose is so important that the body doesn't only want to have the momentary entry of sugar into cells, it would like to be able to create a kind of savings account for glucose for a future time of need. And one of those savings account banks in the human body are human muscles. And muscles have a large number of glucose or insulin receptors on their surface, so that when insulin is released, it attaches to the locks on the surface of muscle cells, opens the door, and glucose can enter. And that glucose will then be converted through a series of steps into a kind of bank reserve of glucose called glycogen, which is nothing more than a large series of glucose molecules put together in a small space to serve as kind of a savings account for glucose for a future time of need. So the bottom line, though, is there are a number of lifestyle factors, including high-fat diets, lack of physical exercise, sleep deficiency, and stress, chronic stress, that will compromise the body's ability of insulin to attach to those locks. In a sense, they change the locks on the door. And if you think about this, if you change the lock on the door and try to stick the old key in it, it won't fit and you can't open the door. So when those locks are effectively changed, insulin can no longer attach effectively. And when insulin can't attach effectively, the door can't open and sugar can't enter those cells. We call that process the body resisting the attachment of insulin, or insulin resistance, or a decrease in insulin sensitivity. All of that language is used to describe the same thing. Now, if insulin can't attach and the door can't open and sugar can't enter the cell, that means sugar is going to keep rising in your bloodstream. And now you're going to have elevated blood sugar. And we already saw that elevated blood sugar is a toxic stress to the body. And when you have elevated blood sugar, your body begins to think that you're not producing enough insulin. So the first thing your pancreas will try to do is overproduce insulin and create something called hyperinsulinemia, an excess of insulin in the blood. And insulin will work like a growth factor in excess that can trigger cancer growth, cardiovascular disease, a whole range of things that can occur. Now, Because the sugar is being elevated with insulin resistance, for years, everybody made this problem a carbohydrate sugar problem. Oh my God, you got high sugar, you can't eat plants. Really? We come to find out that carbohydrates are not, well, refined carbs are a problem, but plant carbs are not the problem. The problem is high fat, because fat will very easily absorb into the fat, into the muscle cells of the body. And when fat gets into muscle cells and gets into the receptors on those cells, gunking up those receptors and taking up space in those muscle cells, there's no way that insulin can attach or any place for sugar to enter. So sugar levels will now go up. So we can make the argument that the underlying pathology or problem for elevated sugar is high fat in the diet and processed fats in the diet, including all fat. So lower fat content with high carbohydrate, high fiber carbohydrate plants is the best solution to reverse the problem of insulin resistance and reverse the problems of elevated blood sugar. We have people that come into our programs, coming in that are diabetics or people with high blood sugar, and we give them nothing but plant carbohydrate food, and we see the insulin levels drop, or the blood sugar levels drop 100 to 200 points in a few days. So this has been one of the biggest con jobs in history, telling people to eat high-fat animal-based products with diabetes, because all it does is reinforce the underlying pathology. And this is very, very, very important. And this is the reason why eating a diverse whole food plant diet is the best solution to reversing the problems of elevated blood sugar and diabetes.
Another one is adequate water intake. That's totally
Absolutely.
for health, efficient metabolism, long-term weight control. And
Fat breakdown and weight regulation requires significant amounts of fluid for that to happen. So if you are dehydrated, it will interfere with weight loss and fat loss.
Salt is most overused and abused condiment in the human diet. And personally for me, I can't have it at all because it's going to raise my blood pressure in a New York minute.
Right.
And it causes me, and I'm one of the rare ones that I get blood pressure headaches, which is unusual because it's known as the silent killer. But and most people don't know that they have high blood pressure, but
Right.
they do. Anyway, back to salt. It's the primary additive along with sugar and oil used by the processed food industry to produce hyper palatable junk food
Of
that
course.
drives compulsive overeating and food addiction and causes significant problems with losing weight and keeping it off.
On another session, we'll devote a lot of time to food addiction with that process, because I want to go into the historical perspective of all of that. But when we look at salt, understand that it's a fundamental compound made up of just two minerals, sodium and chlorine. And as it turns out, people don't realize that the body is electromagnetic in nature. Every cell of the body is like a little battery in miniature, generating an electrical current. That's why we can put electrodes on the chest and measure the electrical discharge of the heart in an EKG. That's why we can put electrodes on the skull and measure the electrical discharge of the brain in an EEG. So the body's constantly giving off current. And as it turns out, that current is being generated by the batteries of the cells because of the movement of two primary minerals or electrolytes called sodium and potassium. But understand that the body holds on to sodium like a miser. There is a consort of organs, including lungs, liver, kidney, and adrenal glands, that end up promoting a situation where the body remarkably retains sodium like a miser in our bloodstream. And the reason it does that is that sodium will attract many times its weight in water. So by holding on to sodium, the body will ensure that you have adequate fluid pressure in your circulatory system to get blood to all of the cells and tissues of the body. So what usually happens is potassium is eliminated through the kidney and sodium is retained like a miser. So because of that dynamic, it would make sense to think about the fact that if you want a diet really suited to human consumption, that diet should be much higher in potassium and much lower in sodium, because we hold on to sodium vigorously and we turn potassium over through the kidney. And that's exactly what a whole foods, plant food diet is. It's much higher in potassium, much lower in sodium. But if you look at the processed diet, and you made the point, sodium is one of the ubiquitous components of all ultra processed foods to create hyperpalatability and food addiction, obviously. And so we find that that diet is off the charts in sodium and very negligible in potassium. So depending on who you read, you need anywhere between 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams of sodium a day. I think we can function quite well on 1,000 to 1,500, getting most of our sodium really remarkably from whole foods. But the average American is consuming more than 4,000 milligrams of sodium a day. Sodium can retain as much as 70 times its weight in water. So think about increasing all that fluid volume. It would elevate blood pressure. It's like putting more fluid through a hose, increasing the pressure. And so that's a big issue. We know that we also know that because of that fluid retention, that contributes to weight. Every pint of water is a pound of weight. So, you're retaining fluid, you're retaining weight. And many times when people start eating plant-based foods, that diet's much higher in potassium, the body starts kicking out that fluid, and they've got to walk around with their own porta potty because they're urinating so much, getting rid of all of that fluid, basically. We now know that excess sodium will remarkably increase inflammation and damage to the lining of blood vessel walls. The cells that are on the inner lining of blood vessels next to the space where blood is moving are cells called endothelial cells. They are the cells that become irritated, inflamed, and damaged in heart disease. Those cells also take an amino acid called L-arginine and convert it into something called nitric oxide, which allows blood vessels to dilate so fluid can move comfortably through that and get to all the cells of the body. There is an extra lining on the very small blood vessels of the body, capillary beds, called the endocalyx. It's kind of like a gel that protects that lining against damage. Sodium will damage that lining and actually create an inflammatory change on the wall of blood vessels and interfere with the production of nitric oxide. So blood vessels now will constrict rather than dilate, and now you've got an increase in pressure, increased damage, increased potential changes. So, and also it will alter taste sensitivity in the mouth. You have a threshold for taste in the mouth. All the taste buds have a threshold. The more condiments you use, the more you desensitize the bud. So now you need more of that to generate taste. Think about how many people you may know out there in the audience that before they even taste their food, they got a salt shaker going. And my father was like that. And he would always, oh, the food is tasteless. And I would say, Dad, the food's not tasteless. You are, because you can't taste anything until you add all of that extra sodium. So what we find is that when you're eating these foods without that added salt, oil, and sugar, you're allowing the taste buds to recalibrate. You'll become more sensitive in your taste. You'll be more appreciative of the wonderful taste of even simple things like lettuce and celery and cucumbers and things that, don't have a lot of additive sweetness, and certainly more open to the taste of sweet fruits and fresh fruits and things of that nature. So it reduces inflammation, it reduces fluid volume and pressure, and there is no reason to add it at all. And my advice is to start using in your food prep, which I find a lot of people don't use enough of, all of the herbs and spices that are used, that can be used, that provide tremendous nutrition, and now will add remarkable flavors to food where you won't miss the salt for 1 second in your food prep. And if you have a problem with salt, what I recommend is don't cook with it. Maybe when you finish making something, just put a little sprinkle of iodized salt right on the surface of something that you really feel the need to do that with as you're making a transition. And that will be very, very helpful.
Oh my gosh, it's so true, especially for the amount of salt that's in stuff in the restaurant. When we were redoing our kitchen, we'd gutted it and we were going out more. And I went to a restaurant and I got a salad and a bean soup. And I brought my own dressing. So it was just a salad and I plain salad, put my own dressing on it. And I got a cup of bean soup. And I made sure, no oil, no animal products, blah, blah, blah. And I forgot to ask about the salt. I didn't get out to the parking lot. I thought my head was going to split open. And in that one cup, it was like 65% of your daily nutritional needs in that one cup of,
Yeah.
of soup. That, and then the other one, we went to one of those Mexican restaurants where you can go, I want this, I want this, I want this, I want this. And unfortunately, the line was long. And I started Googling, and I went on their website where you can do like, I'm going to get this, I'm going to get this, I'm going to get this. If I had gotten that meal, it would have been 2 days of
Right.
sodium in that one
And it
meal.
remarkably increases inflammation. It really does. Years ago when we would fast people with autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, fasting has tremendous efficacy in autoimmune diseases because it dramatically reduces inflammation quickly. And they would go back to eating if we didn't really highlight the fact that they needed to be they're very salt sensitive, they need to be careful. That inflammation would come back in a heartbeat with even small additions of salt to the diet. So you have to be careful with it. You really do.
Oh, yes, I know. In my life, I know it very well. Turmeric has many benefits. How
Yeah.
much should we consume daily to get the full impact of this amazing spice?
Look, the diet that we're recommending is so generally anti-inflammatory anyway. So my feeling is if you wanted to even use an eighth to a quarter of a teaspoon of turmeric in your eating plan would still be fine. You don't need to get into large amounts of turmeric. If you love it and you want to add more, you can. But the phytonutrient content, the curcumins in turmeric and the nutrients in turmeric and the anti-inflammatory potential of turmeric is real and it's good and it's beautiful, but so is so many of the other foods we're recommending. So I just urge you to use it within the context of a nice diversity of other spices and other herbs in addition to the whole plants that we're recommending.
Well, Dr. Sabatino, as always, you are a walking encyclopedia. Can't say enough about it. And thank you for tonight for sharing your knowledge and about your book, Weightless. Everybody should get one.
Yeah, it's Weightless, Compassionate Weight Loss for Life. I really want people to get that title because we're highlighting the compassionate plant focus of the way we can promote sustainable weight loss across time. And I want people that have attended to come back because with each of these sessions, we're going to get into different aspects of things that I think you'll find interesting as we build on the theme of the book. So,
Right? Well, you've broken it into 5-part series. This is part 1 of 5. So Dr. Sabatino is going to be coming back. We're going to be discussing special considerations, concerns, and consequences from his book, Weightless, Compassionate Weight Loss. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and I appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful evening.
thank you, everybody. Good night.